Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that. But it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, a vampire cult in Kentucky? You bet, and it ends in murder. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, with my eldritch co-host, Alice.
Hi, Brett. I don't know what that means.
Hi, Alice. How are you?
I'm doing all right, but this may be one of the words I think it's in the English language, I am completely stumped about.
Yeah, it means weird and sinister or ghostly. So,
oh my goodness. I'm not going to
But it is a compliment in October. It is a compliment. So
it's a compliment coming from you.
You got to run with it.
Because you love all things
exactly
like that.
I do.
Well, thank you.
By the time people hear this, we're almost to Halloween. So I hope everybody's ready.
Do you know what you're going to be for Halloween yet?
I don't know yet. We've been kind of kicking around things. I mean, as we record this, it's not even October yet, so I got some time to figure it out. But hopefully, by the time you are listening to this, I will know what I'm going to be for Halloween. Do you know what you're going to be?
I think I do. So my son wanted to be yet another truck, and so instead of being a truck, I convinced him to be a firefighter so he could carry a fire truck. So I think I'm going to be a siren. Have a shining light on my head.
There you go. That's great. That's amazing.
I like to go for the funny
That's
factor.
Amazing. Yeah.
Kind of like in Mean Girls when everyone else goes as a sexy kitten or a sexy nurse, and Lindsay Lohan's character goes as the most frightening character.
I thought she went as a molecule or something. Oh no, that was her friend who went as a molecule, right?
I have no idea. That might be another.
Somebody
movie.
Went as a molecule. I don't know. Maybe I'm making that up. I'm sure someone is correcting us even as we speak. So let us know what Lindsay Lohan and her friends go to the party as. I think she's supposed to go as something science-y with one of her friends, but instead she goes as the scary vampire character, which is appropriate for today's case that we're going to cover.
There you go, full circle.
There you go, because we have a vampire story for you. A real kind of vampire. I mean, it's not a supernatural vampire, but the person that we're going to talk about today, Rod Ferrell, he certainly believed that he was a vampire, or at least the people who followed him did. And what began as maybe sort of an innocent game, a fantasy, quickly spiraled into murder. And as strange as it may sound, we're going to be spending some time in Kentucky today talking about this. A shout out to those of you from Kentucky who I'm sure are very familiar with this case. And we'll end up kind of all over. We're going to be in Florida for a little while and then all the way to Louisiana. And, this is one of those cases that it's hard to talk about this case without talking about the satanic panic that we've mentioned many times on this podcast that really happened in the 80s. And by the time this case occurred in 1996, had started to peter out. It was basically over. And then all of a sudden you have a case which made the satanic panic seem like maybe they weren't all that crazy. Maybe there was something to it. So we're going to talk about that some more too as we get into this case. But for those of you who are not familiar with Rod and his vampire cult, we'll give you the background. So Rod Ferrell, he did not have an easy life by any stretch of the imagination, which was going to become important in the trial that ends up happening in this case. Though separating what is fact from what is fiction in Rod's life, even from an early age, is difficult. Now, what we can say for certain is that Rod, he never knew his father. His father left his mother, Sandra Gibson, shortly after he was born and joined the military. And the home in which Rod lived was perhaps as dysfunctional as you could imagine. Sandra was a sex worker who struggled with a psychotic disorder and drug addiction. Now, according to Sandra, at some point, she moves in with her parents to try and give Rod some stability. And also, it's a very difficult situation she's in. She's dealing with a lot. She needs help. But according to her, at least, her father sexually abused Rod when he was only 5 or 6 years old during a fishing trip. Now, I say, according to Sandra, this happened because the details of what Sandra says is the first in what are going to be a lot of very strange accusations that are made in this case. Sandra said that Rod was abused by multiple men in the woods and even indicated that she believed this was a part of some sort of cult ritual. Rod would later tell police that his grandfather was a member of something called the Black Mask, and that he was a part of a ritual where all members of the cult raped him to become one with each other and then sacrificed a person to the devil. Now, Alice, I feel like we kind of have to just stop there and talk about that because that's sort of a case unto itself.
Woo! Now it's a lot.
It is a lot.
I mean, it's a lot because the allegation is coming from Rod's mother and then also Rod. When you're a child and you hear a story over and over and it kind of becomes family lore where you can tell a story and in your memory it's as if you're watching a movie rather than you yourself remembering it. This sounds like that, right? When Rod tells police this Black Mask cult ritual, it almost sounds like he's describing a scene that's been described to him.
And in fact, this part of the story is very much satanic panic-esque. These are the kind of stories that you would hear from kids who were involved in various aspects of this. Some of you are familiar with the Martinsville daycare and similar stories along those lines where kids who were in daycare would tell the police that their daycare was the center of a satanic cult and that they were being sexually assaulted in the basement of these buildings that often didn't have basements, where people were sacrificed in front of them. They were forced to drink blood. They were forced to eat human flesh. Just insane things that people just assumed, look, nobody, not even a child, could make this up. Maybe especially a child couldn't make this up. But in the years that followed, we learned that the power of suggestion is so great that these kids truly believed these things were happening to them. But in fact, they were not. There were no tunnels underneath these buildings leading to, satanic grottos where all this kind of stuff was happening. And what's interesting about this, you can imagine what that would do to you as a child, how difficult it would be to overcome that. Nothing bad happened to you, but you believed it did so deeply that you're telling the police it happened, you're testifying in trial about it happening, you're reliving this event, weeping about it. and the trauma there. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine that. And you have that with Rod. Rod believes this is true. Whether it's true or not, he believes it's true because his mother told him it was true. So he spent his whole life thinking his grandfather, was a part of some sort of satanic cult and that he was ritually, sexually abused at the age of 5. And he grew up with that as sort of the foundation for a very long time in his life. And whether it actually happened or not, I guess, is up for debate. Maybe there are some people who do think it happened, but Rod believed it. And Sandra kind of hammered this into Rod's head by confronting her father with Rod. So she takes Rod to her grandfather's and confronts him with this story, which apparently was also very traumatic for the young boy and sort of reestablished in his mind the truth of this abuse. Now, by the time Rod was a teenager, he was utterly lost. He had very few friends, and he certainly didn't fit in Eustis, Florida, where he and his mother had moved. While he was there, he briefly dabbled with occultism and vampirism, but even that didn't really fit. He didn't really fit with the crowd of kids who were doing that at the time, but he did bond with a couple girls, Heather Windorf and Audrey Presson, over their mutual interest in witchcraft. He particularly liked Heather, who hung a Barbie doll from a noose on her backpack. Alice, before we move on, I want to talk about one of our favorite sponsors, PDS Debt. How many of you wish there was a better solution to paying off your debt? Our sponsor, PDS Debt, has customized debt slashing options for credit cards, personal or student loans, medical bills, collections, or any other type of debt. We spoke with the owners at PDS Debt who let us know that because of COVID-19, now is the best time to take advantage of options to get out of debt. So many people have been struggling with debt during the pandemic that you may qualify for programs where certain debts can be reduced or completely eliminated from your credit card. Don't put it off and don't wait for these debt canceling programs to no longer be available. It takes less than 60 seconds to go to pdsdebt.com/TP and find out how to resolve your debt now. 5 simple questions will get you a free credit report and a proven plan to become debt-free. There is really nothing to lose. The worst-case scenario is you walk away with a free credit report and a better understanding of how to get rid of your debt. So if you're making payments every month on your debt and your balances aren't going down, this program is for you. PDS Debt rolls all of your payments into one low 0% interest monthly payment. No minimum credit score required. Bad and fair credit accepted. You can save thousands in interest and fees and pay off your debt in a fraction of the time. PDS Debt is offering a free debt saving plan and credit report just for completing the quick and easy debt assessment at www.pdsdebt.com/TP. That's pdsdebt.com/TP. Take back your financial freedom today by visiting pdsdebt.com/TP.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy. I'm cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. One purchased equals one donated. Now go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistant's assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Now, when Rod moved from Eustis to the small town of Murray, Kentucky, a dry county in southwest Kentucky, that I'm sure is a wonderful place to live, but honestly just doesn't have a lot going on, no one could have predicted the transformation that would happen to Rod. But in that county of around 30,000 people, there was apparently a pretty healthy occult scene. Rod's mother got involved in the occult, and she would later claim that the leader of the cult repeatedly raped her as part of satanic rituals. Rod found a group of people his age who had formed a vampire cult based on the book and RPG Vampire the Masquerade.
You know, once again, Rod's mom, right? Like, he moves to Murray. She gets involved in this cult. She says she's being raped as part of a satanic ritual. I'm not saying she wasn't raped. Maybe she was. I doubt seriously it was part of some ritual, but she's feeding this back to her son. These are all important things because, as I said earlier, at some point there's going to be a murder in this case, spoiler alert, and there's going to be a trial in this case, and there's going to be some question about what the punishment should be for Rod and some others who are involved in that murder. And once you get into the punishment phase, then all of a sudden you're not just talking about the facts of the crime, you're talking about the person. And you're trying to figure out, based on who that person is and where they came from and what they've gone through, what punishment do they deserve? Are there any mitigating factors that might make you think they don't deserve maybe as harsh a punishment as the crime might normally call for? And all of this stuff is important because you can see how Rod, who is a child, you know, he's from the age of 5, I mean, now he's in his early teenage years, he's about 16, is being shaped by this horrible foundation, this terrible home life he has with a mom who clearly has some mental issues, has some diagnosed mental issues, and is feeding this to her son, that all of this satanic stuff is going on and all this violence is happening to her. And that's what he's immersed in. I mean, that's what he goes home to every day. And, you know, he's trying to find some escape. He's trying to find some outlet for what I'm sure is a lot of anger and frustration with his family. And he finds this group of kids who are into vampire stuff. They're playing a role-playing game called Vampire the Masquerade, where they're pretending to be vampires, right? And to them, this is they all probably recognize that this is just a game. They're just playing a game, no big deal. But for Rod, this is a gateway for him into something darker.
Right. And remember, you know, from his mother, we know that she does suffer from some degree of mental illness. He is seeing the occult as something that is his everyday. And it's even something that may draw him closer to his mother, right? It's what his mother, it talks about all the time. It's what she finds community in. And Rod doesn't have, you know, much family around. The only family really he has is his mother. His father is gone. And so you can imagine that a young boy may want to be closer to his mother. So he may be drawn to these sorts of groups because his own mother is.
And let me just say this before we continue, because somebody got mad at me for some comment I made in the Scott Peterson case about like Wicca and Satanism. We are not talking about sort of mainstream occult activity or occult groups or Wicca or the Church of Satan or anything like that. This is what they are doing is some really like messed up stuff, right? That doesn't really have any basis in any sort of organized formal religion. And we don't even know how much of this is a fantasy in Rod's mother's head. All we know is this is the stuff he's hearing and the effect that it's having on him.
Yeah, and the things we're talking about are things that cross the lines of into breaking the law, right? We can get into a deeper conversation sometime about First Amendment and where your First Amendment rights to practice your religion freely and the law. But here we're talking about clearly crossing the rape clearly crosses the line. In this country, at least, we've decided that even if you claim some sort of religious belief to commit rape, we don't allow that in our society, right? So we're talking about the practices that are somehow wrapped up in these cults that we're talking about here. As Brett mentioned, for most of the kids playing this vampire game, The kids were playing it just as that, a game. But for Rod, fantasy and reality began to merge. It didn't help that his mother had also gotten involved in vampirism either. On one occasion, she attempted to seduce a 14-year-old, writing, quote, "I long to be near you for your embrace. Yes, to become a vampire, a part of the family, immortal and truly yours forever."
And, I mean, this 14-year-old is one of Rod's friends. He's another member of this vampire cult that, that his mother has gotten involved in. It's kind of funny. I'm glad Mom's supporting Rod's artistic endeavors, but this is probably not exactly what you would want. And then, of course, she takes it way too far. She's seducing this 14-year-old boy, this child, and she's going to be prosecuted for that. And obviously, this is just yet another problem for Rod and another blow to him. And you can just see how he's spiraling farther and farther into fantasy because he needs some escape from reality, right? I mean, reality sucks for him, frankly. So it's not surprising that he starts to take on this persona more and more. And soon he had gone from playing the game to having a cult of his own. He didn't like the group. They didn't take it seriously enough. He thought they were way too, they just wanted to sit around and talk. And he wanted to have a real vampire cult. And so he was able to get these other group of kids to follow him because he was very charismatic and he had some innate leadership qualities. And he promised them something more than just a game. He promised them something real. And he initiated his cult members in a local ceremony. And this initiation consisted of cutting each other's arms and sucking each other's blood. They called it crossing over. And when you cross over, you drink the blood of the vampire who is sort of like your sire now. He's like your father in vampirism, which is what Rod was. And then you become a vampire as well, and you can bring other people into the cult. At this point, Rod has kind of fully gone into this. He's now saying that he's a 500-year-old vampire named Visago. He's saying that he has the ability to do things like read minds and hypnotize people with his eyes. His friends started telling people, never look him in the eyes because he'll hypnotize you. He has these abilities that are supernatural. And this quickly spiraled into some pretty gruesome stuff. Ferrell and his group of teen vampires were known to abduct dogs and sacrifice them as part of their rituals. At some point, police believe there were about 30 kids involved in this cult, but that number seems as though it must be high. It probably is very high. We're talking probably more like 5 or 6 people here, but with the whole panic aspect of this, you find out you have a vampire cult in Murray, Kentucky, you're going to think half the people there are involved, right? So it's not surprising that they would say that, but it was real. This existed, and they were doing things. At the same time, Rod is keeping in touch with Heather Windorf, which is one of the girls we mentioned earlier, one of the girls who sort of introduced him into the teen cults and the occult and witchcraft and vampirism when he was in Florida. And according to him, and this is going to be something that's disputed, and we'll get into more later, she began telling him that her parents were sexually abusing her. Now, remember, this is the sore spot for Rod. Rod, in his mind, he believes that he was sexually abused when he was 5 or 6 years old by many different people, but also his grandfather. So for him, this would have been something that enraged him, and he decided to take action. He was going to save Heather, and the way he was going to do that is he was going to murder her parents.
It's really interesting, this the common thing that's running through the story so far, from Rod to his mother to now Heather, is sexual abuse. Whether it is actually happening or not, but the allegations of sexual abuse are very deep, and that's probably part of the occult as well. Like you mentioned, it is not, throughout history, sex has been used as forms of either purification or, as you said, joining as one. And you can see how that can be very perverted. That can be brought to an extreme that would cause perversion of it, right? And so I don't know whether Heather got the idea, where it kind of stemmed from, whether it was true or not.
Alice is 100% right. I mean, sex can be about control. Those of you who follow cults often have a sexual aspect to them. So Nexium obviously has a sexual aspect to it. Any of these, if you guys watch the Wild Wild Country on Netflix, also has a sexual aspect to it. Oftentimes, a lot of these cults, the leaders of the cults, are sexually abusing people. And it is one of their ways to exercise control over people. And because they have control over people, they're able to take advantage of them sexually. And so you may have something like that here. And it's not so much, I mean, we're talking about vampire cults and we're talking about the occult, and we're talking about Satanism. These are just vessels into which these pretty common things are poured, right? So it's not as if you have Satanism, so therefore you must have sexual abuse. No, when you have people who are acting like this, when they're forming these groups with one charismatic leader who is absolutely in control and who everybody owes fealty to, sexual abuse tends to follow, like, night follows day when you have that, whatever it is, whatever religion it might be, or, Nexium wasn't a religion. I mean, Nexium was all about, like, making more money. It was a pyramid scheme as much as anything. It was like a multi-level marketing scheme, but it also had these, like, weird cult aspects, and it had this weird sexual abuse that was going on because people are looking for something to belong to. And sometimes what they end up belonging to are these really abusive things. So that's what we're talking about here. And I think Alice is right. Not sure exactly what's going on. Not sure which of these stories are true and which aren't. It would not surprise me at all, though, if there were some people who were being sexually assaulted throughout this, including Rod's mom, including Rod, maybe even Heather. But it's just much more prosaic, maybe, than the stories that are being told to us. For instance, I mean, Rod's grandfather may have sexually assaulted him. We don't know. He may have abused him. But I bet if he did, it was something much more prosaic than, the cult of the mask, the cult of the black mask, and sacrificing someone in front of him and all that stuff. I mean, that's fantasy. That part is fantasy. But the actual assault may not be, and the damage that's left behind is obvious. So you've got Rod in this situation where if it's true that Heather told him that, it would have been a major trigger for him. He's already angry. He has a group of people who follow him and do whatever he says. He's already open to violence. He's already started to act violently. Those of you who know anything about serial killers know that one of the first things serial killers do is they abuse animals. They kill animals. And here you have these dogs that are being killed. They're describing them as sacrifices, but I think it's actually just an example of the violence that's sort of welling up in Rod. And now he's ready to take the next step. He's ready to take the next step to not killing dogs anymore, but to kill a person. At least that is the story that Rod told. Heather would later deny these claims altogether and say that she had never suggested that Rod should kill her parents. In fact, she had specifically said she did not want him to kill her parents. And what's interesting about this is prosecutors kind of take Heather's side on this. They theorize that Rod killed Heather's parents simply because he wanted her to come with him and needed her car, or her parents' car, for his clan's trip to New Orleans, which is where they were going. His car was on its last legs, and killing Heather's parents would have provided transportation.
And that's what Rod needed. He was tired of Murray, Kentucky, and he wanted to get down to New Orleans, which he believed to be the center of vampiric activity in the United States. Those of you who have been to New Orleans probably know what Rod's thinking of. New Orleans has a lot of interesting culture, and certainly into kind of speaking with the other side. And there's a lot of you can see it right, on Bourbon Street. It's not even hidden away. It's actually worn proudly on New Orleans's front. And he also really wanted to experience Mardi Gras, which was a full 3 months away at the time. Rod told the group that he knew a voodoo priest in New Orleans who they could stay with. And so he had this whole trip planned out. Now, whatever the motive, on November 25th, Rod and one of the other vampire clan members, Howard Scott Anderson, entered the Wendorf home through the garage. Rod picked up a crowbar. He found Richard Wendorf asleep on the couch, and he beat Richard to death. The attack was so brutal and sudden that, mercifully, Richard probably never even woke up. Naomi Queen was in the shower. When she came out, she walked into the midst of the scene. She had a cup of hot coffee in her hand, which she threw at Rod. Rod knocked her to the ground and then straddled her, bashing in her skull with the same crowbar. Now, with the murder complete, the two boys stole the family's Explorer and went to pick up the rest of the group, who included Charity Kessie, Dana Cooper, and Heather Wendorf. They began their cross-country journey, robbing houses along the way for guns, money, and food. They made it all the way to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, before Charity made the mistake of calling her grandmother for money. Granny turned them in, and the police arrested the group.
And I always wonder, I realize these are a bunch of teenagers, so it's not as if they're thinking clearly or making long-term plans. But you always wonder when you hear a case like this, what did they think was going to happen?
Right.
Even Lois Race, that case, the worm lady, what did she think was going to happen? Was she just going to keep driving across country, murdering people forever? They were going to get down to New Orleans and hang out with this voodoo priest until Mardi Gras and then do Mardi Gras. And then what? What are you going to do? You've murdered somebody.
Brett, though, so many of our cases, we turn to each other when when it finally lands on our desk and we say, how did these people get away with this for so many years, for so many different robberies, for so many, X, Y, and Z. And so I don't know. I think maybe when you do it once and you get away with it and you're not caught immediately, right? The police don't come immediately. The sirens aren't turned on. You're not, handcuffed and thrown in jail. You think, well, I got away one time. I can do it again. Even though the reality is it takes some time to build a case and it takes some time to kind of track someone's movements. But I do think there's kind of this invincibility that goes with people who commit a crime and get away with it. And certainly we know that to be a phenomena with young adults and with teenagers, that they are above it all, that they are invincible.
Before we move on, I want to talk about one of our favorite sponsors, Hello Fresh. Alice, it feels like our life is getting busier and busier. People are coming back to work. The court's ramping up. We got a couple trials ahead, and it's now more than ever that I'm glad I can get fresh, pre-measured ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to my doorstep with Hello Fresh. I can skip the trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. And that's why it's America's #1 meal kit. HelloFresh offers 50 menu and market items to choose from every week, including vegetarian, calorie smart, and gourmet options, providing plenty of variety.
Brett, I'm always talking about how busy I am with a full-time job as a prosecutor, doing our podcast, and trying to feed my family of 4, some very hungry boys. It's almost impossible if I didn't have HelloFresh. And, just last night we made the winner chicken orzo dinner, and my baby toddler was screaming, "Orzo, Orzo." He was so excited and ate all of it. We had no leftovers, even though the portions were huge. And HelloFresh isn't just for meals. Their marketplace features a variety of snacks, like this fall's pumpkin cinnamon rolls to get you in the mood for a cozy season.
And Alice, we love Green Chef, and Green Chef is now owned by HelloFresh. And with a wider array of meal plans to choose from, there's something for everyone. I love both brands. I love switching between the brands. And now our listeners can enjoy both brands at a discount on us. So go to HelloFresh.com/TP14 and use code TP14 for up to 14 free meals, including free shipping. That's HelloFresh.com/TP14, code TP14 for 14 free meals and free shipping. And find out for yourself why HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit.
As we already mentioned, there was a trial in this case. So what is the trial strategy? Because there is a lot going on here. In a reversal of what you might expect, the prosecution tried to make the case purely about the murder, without the sensationalism of the vampire cult. So, note, this is the opposite of what we saw in Temujin Kensu, of West Memphis 3, of the Jeffrey McDonald case, this was really just about the brutal beating to death of these two people by a crowbar. And the defense tried to make the case about the vampire cult. So you would think, what? It seems like it would be the other way around. And I think partly the reason for this trial strategy is that the murder was so heinous and so obvious. It was clear who beat them to death. And the defense is actually using the vampire cult as a defense as to how Rod was essentially brainwashed. And the reason the defense did this is it's pretty simple. Rod was not going to win his case if this was just about the murder. And after initially threatening a trial, he would plead guilty. So the whole case turned on whether or not this 16-year-old would get the death penalty. The prosecution wanted him to be a clear-thinking, cold-blooded killer. And the defense wanted to present someone who was awash in fantasy so that they could fight the death penalty.
And that brings us to the sentencing in this case, which really is the case. And in fact, the sentencing phase basically was the trial. The prosecution ended up putting on all the witnesses it would have put on in trial to make the case for the death penalty. And we're going to explain to you sort of how that works in the United States. And it kind of comes down to what they call aggravators versus mitigators. So for a brief period of time, only a couple years, the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional in the United States in a 1972 case called Furman versus Georgia. Now, it's not that the death penalty itself was unconstitutional, which would be somewhat unusual given the text of the Constitution, which sort of presupposes its existence, but that rather the death penalty had been implemented in a way that violated due process. Essentially, it was too random. You couldn't predict it. And, you had like weird biases that would occur, or maybe you would have racial biases that would occur. So basically the Supreme Court said, look, if you're going to have the death penalty, you got to come up with a way to have it that eliminates some of this randomness so that the person who gets it actually deserves it. And it was only 4 years later that Georgia was back in the Supreme Court. They passed a new death penalty statute. And this time, in a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court upheld Georgia's death penalty statute and set out how the death penalty should be applied going forward. So it sort of gave a model for what these statutes should look like. So the first, it called for a bifurcated system. So you have a trial phase, and then you have a death penalty phase. So in this case, there is no trial because Rod pled guilty, but you then have this penalty phase where the jury is going to be asked to decide whether or not this person should get the death penalty. Those of you who've been following the Scott Peterson case know that Scott Peterson's death penalty was overturned, and the reason he was overturned is because when the judge was questioning jurors about the death penalty, the first question you ask is, are you opposed to the death penalty? Could you impose the death penalty? If you say, I'm opposed to it, I don't know if I could oppose it. The judge is supposed to work with you on that. Well, this is the law, and this is how it works, and, what if you found these factors? Would you be able to put aside your own biases and nevertheless sit on the jury? And they didn't do that. It was just if you said no, you got bounced. And so eventually the state of California said that violated Scott Peterson's rights to have the death penalty jury selected in a way that was fair to him because they didn't take that next step. So that's the kind of thing you have to do when you're figuring this out. Second, the Supreme Court called for some sort of process by which the death penalty could be applied in a more consistent way. So once again, this is the 70s. We've talked about this before. There was this sort of, let's make everything scientific. Let's make everything less, wishy-washy and less random. So we're going to apply some standards to try to make it more consistent. And that's where these aggravators and mitigators come in. So the first thing that has to happen is the jury has to find that there are aggravating factors of the crime. So, if there are no aggravating factors, then you're not death penalty eligible. And some factors include the murder of children, police officers, multiple people, murders involving torture or sexual assault. It depends from state to state. Some states, if you kill someone in a moving car, if you shoot if you shoot from a moving car or if you shoot into a moving car, that is an aggravator. And that basically was a response to drive-by shootings. Is you wanted to make drive-by shootings particularly bad because they are so dangerous and they lead to so many innocent people being killed that became an aggravator that made you eligible for the death penalty. So now you're eligible. Well, then you start looking at mitigating factors and you ask, do the aggravating factors, whatever they are, outweigh whatever mitigating factors there are? Now, aggravating factors are limited by a statute, so the statute has to tell you what the aggravating factors are. Mitigating factors, there's no limit on those. The defense can raise anything they want. And so, what's basically happened in the wake of this is if you see a death penalty phase, it is a parade of horribles. It's just going to be how terrible the person's life was. All these really awful things that happened to them, starting as young as you can go. And you're going to have witness after witness after witness that talks about the abuse they suffered and just all the bad things that happened to them. And then you're going to have some doctors who are going to talk about how because of that abuse and maybe drug abuse or alcohol abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, their brain developed in a strange way and they don't really think things through, or they react violently without thinking. I mean, anything you can do to sort of mitigate their responsibility for the actions they took that led to the death. And Rod had so many horribles to parade. We've already talked about some of them, but we're going to give you even more. And the defense started before he was even born, noting that his umbilical cord had been wrapped around his throat in the womb, cutting off the oxygen to his brain and potentially causing brain damage. If that's not enough, he suffered encephalitis as a child that brought him to the edge of death, to the point that the doctors told his mother he would not survive the night. We know that his father abandoned him. He never even knew him. His mother was unstable. She had mental illness problems and obviously some really crazy fantasies that were affecting him. His grandfather, he either sexually abused him, maybe had multiple people sexually abuse him, or whether that happened or not, Rod believed it happened because of his mother's accusations. And the point of bringing all this up is to argue that even if the person still responsible for the crime still need to be punished, but their history is serious enough that the jury should show them some mercy and decide not to impose the death penalty. And ultimately, it is the jury's decision. If the jury says no death penalty, then there's no death penalty. That wasn't always true, but that's the way it is now. If the jury says no to the death penalty, the judge has no choice but to give the defendant life in prison.
And, you all may be hearing the litany of hardships that Rod suffered as just horrible, and they are horrible. But one thing to know you can read about a lot of these in opinions. You don't have to necessarily sit through the penalty phase of death penalty cases because it's just emotionally very difficult. His stories are not uncommon, unfortunately, in death penalty cases. Death penalty eligible cases typically are the most heinous of crimes, and so it's not surprising that these people usually have gone through a lot of hardship in their life to get them to where they are are mentally, emotionally able to commit these sorts of crimes. So I only note that because you can pull any of these cases, cases are published publicly, and you can read the records of death penalty cases, and they call them mitigating factors, which typically we think of mitigating as, making something better. And in this case, it is making it better in the sense that it is better if you don't get the death penalty in the view of the defendant. But these mitigating factors are just heart-wrenching, to put it even lightly. There was also a battle of the experts. And we've talked about lots of battles of the experts, but you will see experts in death penalty types of cases because, of course, life is on the line. Now, as part of the argument, both sides brought in psychologists to study Rod. This is also pretty common because you want to see what the effect is on his mental ability to appreciate what he's done. Dr. Wade Myers evaluated Rod for the defense. Myers said that Rod was certainly disturbed, and he recounted the lengthy struggles that Rod had gone through growing up. But in some tests, it was obvious that Rod was malingering. In other words, Rod was faking it. He was trying to appear more mentally ill than he actually was. Myers said at one point that it was as if Rod was playing a game with him. This is not great testimony for the defense because remember, Myers is the defense's expert. But Myers did testify that Rod suffered from depression and schizotypal personality disorder, which meant that Rod heard voices and saw things that weren't there, and that he suffered from uncontrollable rage. Now, the prosecution expert testified that Rod was essentially faking any mental illness. You can imagine this might be pretty powerful because even the defense's own expert notes that Rod is faking it to some degree. Rod had claimed at one point that he had split personalities, which was demonstrably false. At other times, Rod claimed that a rival vampire clan, one from which Rod had split off from, actually committed the crime. Now, this was also false. Rod later on would eventually claim that it was actually his fellow vampire cult member, Scott Anderson, who killed the couple. So Rod's attempt to get out from under the crime indicated that he was well aware of what he had done and he was trying to cover it up. And part of the theory here is if you have such severe mental illness, you don't know or appreciate what you've done. And so to lie about something shows a level of appreciating the wrongness of what you've done. And Rod here, as you can see, changes his story several times to try and push off the blame. And you do that if you recognize that there is something to be blamed.
Yeah, death penalty sentencing phase, it's kind of like a weird combination of a trial and an insanity defense. So you're not really claiming that your client's insane, because if they were insane, they wouldn't be responsible at all and they could be found not guilty. But you are trying to show that they have enough sort of mental problems and maybe some symptoms of insanity that they're not fully culpable for what they did. So, you know, their responsibility is lessened, and therefore their punishment should not be the greatest possible punishment. You know, you're also trying to show that, you know, it's not that they're not responsible. And defense attorneys will say this. They will say, look, we are not saying that he's not guilty. And we're not saying that he shouldn't be punished. He should be. In fact, he should serve the rest of his life in prison. They always say that. They're always like, he should serve the rest of his life. He should never get out. That's what he should get. And you should give that to him. But he shouldn't get the death penalty for all these reasons, right? And so it's this weird dance you have to do as a defense attorney, because you have to, on the one hand, not make the jury think that you're saying he shouldn't be punished for this crime, because he absolutely should. You don't want him to think that. You want him to know he's going to be punished. You just want them to find enough reason that life in prison's enough and he shouldn't get the death penalty. So it's a weird dance, and that's why you see this sort of quasi-insanity, didn't have the sort of mens rea, the guilty mind necessary. This uncontrollable rage thing, you see it all the time. Very common in death penalty cases for basically the psychologist to come in and say, something happened, and they usually point to a specific thing. And when that thing happened, he could no longer control himself. And once that happened, he was basically out of his mind. Not out of his mind to the extent he's insane, but out of his mind to the extent that you shouldn't hold him fully accountable for what he did. So in this case, you got Rod saying, look, Heather told me she was being sexually abused, and basically from that point forward, I was so filled with rage that I just didn't have any control, and I killed this man, and I wasn't going to kill the woman. He often says that. He often says, I was only going to kill, her abuser, but then she threw that coffee on me, and that made me so mad that I killed her too, and I just was completely out of control. And that's this argument that you want to make for, so you should at least spare my life. Put me in jail for the rest of my life, but don't execute me. And the prosecution, of course, is going to come back with, yeah, so you had a really rough life, but let's look at what you did. And they really get into the viciousness of this murder. They put on evidence. They put on basically all the evidence they would have shown at trial to show that Rod viciously beat his two victims to death with a crowbar. In fact, the attack was so brutal that officers first on the scene actually believed that the victims had been shot. That's how bad it was. Blood, bones, and brain were scattered all over the room. There were also burn marks on the victims in the shape of a V with a number of dots around the V's. This apparently was Rod's symbol, standing for either vampire or Visago. It's never entirely clear. Rod would later say that the whole experience was a rush and he felt like a god. Rod confessed to all of this when he talked to the police, and his confession really hurt him because it really undercut this notion that he didn't enjoy what he did and know exactly what he was doing. And Rod would tell the police that he thought about waiting on Jennifer, who he had known when he was living in Florida, to come home, and then he would kill her too, but he decided on a different path. He said he thought, quote, "Nah, why bother? Let her come home, have a mental breakdown, call the police," which I was correct, she did. So, the jury's hearing that, and a lot of that sympathy and a lot of those thoughts that maybe we should have some mercy here very quickly left the jury's mind.
Brett, before we move on, I am so excited about our newest sponsor, Simply Safe. As prosecutors, we know how important your safety is. I mean, imagine if every crime could be halted before it happened. Well, while you can't stop every criminal in their tracks, what if you could deter them? That's what Simply Safe's new wireless outdoor security camera does. It's wireless so it can install anywhere, extending Simply Safe's perimeter of defense from your windows and doors to the far corners of your property. That's right. Simply Safe, the system that U.S. News and World Report names, quote, best home security system of 2021, just got even better. This brand new outdoor security camera is engineered with all the advanced tech to help keep you and your family safe.
And that includes an ultra-wide 140-degree field of view, so you can keep watch of your entire yard. It has a 1080p HD resolution with an 8-time zoom, which means you can zoom in and clearly see things like faces and license plates to capture critical evidence, which will make our job easier. And it's easy to remove. It has a rechargeable battery. It doesn't need an outlet and can go anywhere on your property. This camera has it all, and it integrates with their Simply Safe home security system, extending its protection to the outside. Together, it means every door, window, and room are protected, and now your property will be too. My parents have Simply Safe, and they love it.
To learn more about the exciting new Simply Safe wireless outdoor security camera, visit simplysafe.com/TP. Simply Safe is offering 20% off your entire new system and your first month of monitoring service free when you enroll in interactive monitoring. Again, that's simplysafe.com/TP.
But here is a question I think a lot of people may be asking. What about Heather in all of this? I know later on she claims that she never told Rod to kill him. Was Heather used by either the defense or the prosecution in the penalty phase of this case?
So Heather did testify, and she testified, as I recall, that she had said that she would go with Rod, that she was fine with them taking the car, but that she had specifically said, like, don't hurt my parents, don't do anything to them. Then she went to say goodbye to her boyfriend. So she went off to say goodbye to her boyfriend, and Rod was supposed to come pick her up in the car, which he eventually did do. But that when he did that, she knew that he had killed her parents, and she freaked out, and she basically was crying and screaming and begging for them to let her go all the way to Louisiana, and she would never be charged in any way. We're going to talk about the other people who were involved in this were charged and convicted and got some pretty hefty sentences, but Heather got away with this. So Rod's always said that she wanted him to kill her parents, but the prosecution never believed that, and they did use her to show that the story that Rod was telling wasn't true.
Now let's move on to the sentences, because we've been going through all this because this is the penalty phase to determine the sentence for Rod. In the end, Rod was sentenced to death, becoming the youngest person on death row at the time. The Florida Supreme Court would later determine that no one under the age of 17 could be sentenced to death, with the United States Supreme Court later raising that age to 18. Because of this later development in the law, Rod would seek to have his sentence reduced to less than life without parole after the Supreme Court also decided that a juvenile could not automatically be sentenced to life without parole. That appeal was denied. The judge had to decide whether Rod was a, quote, juvenile offender whose crimes reflect unfortunate yet transient immaturity, or the rare juvenile offender whose crime reflects irreparable corruption. Rod, the judge determined, was the latter.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Rod was sort of in the middle of this development where the Florida Supreme Court and later the U.S. Supreme Court just kind of said, we're not going to have the death penalty for anybody under a certain age anymore. When you're 18, you can do a lot of things. You can go join the military, fight for your country, vote, lots of other things. And you can do that, when you're 17 too. And, when you're 16, you can drive a car, which is basically the most deadly weapon you'll ever possess. But just at some point, it was just sort of decided, like, under 18, you can't get the death penalty. So since Rod was under 18 when this happened, his sentence essentially automatically became life without parole. And that was just the way it was going to be. And then you had this other development where the Supreme Court's like, and, we're also just going to say that you can't automatically get life without parole. Some judge has to really think about this. So the judge really thought about it and said, yeah, if anybody deserves life without parole, it's you. I mean, this is one of the most brutal crimes you can imagine. The fact that a 16-year-old did this is shocking. Now, look, I mean, that means Rod's going to be in prison for 70, 75 years. I mean, there's no telling how long he'll be there, but he is going to be there for the rest of his life.
Now, Howard Scott Anderson didn't get the death penalty. Instead, he got life imprisonment, though eventually his sentence was reduced to 40 years.
And he's kind of the opposite side of it. The judge basically said, Rod's incorrigible. You were just along for the ride. So I am going to reduce your sentence from life without parole to 40 years. And I think he'll get out in I guess he'll get out in sometime in the 2030s.
Now, the two girls who came with Rod from Kentucky would receive sentences of around 10 years for Charity Kessie and 17 years for Dana Cooper. And as we mentioned, Heather was never charged in the death of her parents. The girls, now women, have been released from prison, so they are out. And as Brett was doing the math, Scott will be released around 2032, and Rod will never leave prison alive.
Yeah, and I'm fine with that. I think that's an appropriate sentence here. Some people have problems with life without parole. They don't think there should be life without parole. They think you should have some opportunity to get out. I just don't feel that way. I mean, to each their own. But in my mind, you kill somebody like this, kill two people like this, you forfeited any right to ever walk free again. Now, you can rehabilitate yourself. You can become a stand-up person in prison. You can become a role model for the guys who are coming in who aren't going to be there for life. You can help other people see the path they're on and get them off of it. And you see that a lot, actually, with people who are in prison for life without parole. And I think that's very commendable. But to me, rehabilitation is only part of prison. Punishment's another part. Justice for the victims are another part. So I think what Rod did was inexcusable. Rod, to this day, is still telling this story about Heather, which I don't think is true. I think Rod needed a car, and that's why he went down there. And Rod had been telling people he wanted to kill somebody, and I think this was an opportunity for him to do it, and so he did it. And I think Rod's where he needs to be.
I think it's important here to note, too, that the sentence fits the crime here, too, because this is not some situation where he's turned on the people he thinks abused him, right? He really has no connection with Heather's parents other than perhaps something Heather told him. But is it up to him to have the justice? He's not being abused by Heather's parents. And really, like you said, at the end of the day, he killed two people brutally for a car, not for vindication of his own life. It was really just for a car. And that factors into judges' minds too when they think about the seriousness of the crime.
So I think that brings us to sort of the ultimate question in this case, which is what role did vampires really play? I mean, we're doing this in October because it's a vampire cult and it seemed appropriate, but it's interesting. Is this just a brutal murder or is there vampirism involved somehow? And there were rumors initially that they had drank the blood of the people they murdered, which is not true at all. And frankly, when you look at this case, I think Alice is right. They killed these people for a car. Not for a satanic ritual, not for some sort of vampire thing. They did it for a car. And I think the vampirism is just sort of, as we've said earlier, it's just a vessel into which Rod's violence was poured. I think this is kind of like the Slender Man case. You guys mostly, I'm sure, familiar with that, where you had two young girls, younger than this, who decided to kill their best friend to appease Slender Man, which is an internet meme, basically. From a forum, I think called Something Awful. This guy came up with this very evocative, modern urban legend lore of this creature called Slender Man, and it took off, and these girls heard about that, and it eventually became their motive for attacking this young girl. But for me, it wasn't Slender Man, right? It wasn't that there was something about Slender Man or Slender Man's to blame. At least one of the girls was suffering from some pretty serious mental illness. The other girl seems like she was under her sway for whatever reason. They just needed an excuse. Slender Man was an excuse for the violence that was going to happen. And the vampire cult and all the satanic stuff, that's just window dressing. It was an excuse. Rod was going to find something that was going to allow him to do the things that he was always going to do. Like, he was headed down this path where he was going to commit violence, and the vampirism, it might have helped him sort of gain control over these people, because that was the edifice he had created to have control over people. But if it hadn't been vampirism, it would have been something else. And I don't think really at the end of the day the vampirism is anything more than just sort of a sexy side aspect of this case. I think this case would have happened, or something like it would have happened, without the vampires.
Right, and that's why I think the prosecution did the right thing in focusing just on the murder, recognizing that, the vampire cult was really just a sideshow.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it was smart of them, and it was responsible of them, too, because as we've seen in other cases, and Alice mentioned them, there is a tendency to be, dramatic, and to be over the top, and to exploit these kind of things to try and get your jury just to think, well, that other guy, he's a member of the other. That's dirty and disgusting, and I don't like vampires, and vampires are scary, and that's not like me. So he must be guilty, and he must deserve the death penalty, so that's what we should give him because he's in all this vampire stuff, right? And that would have been completely irresponsible of the prosecution, and it would have been wrong of the jury. So the fact that the prosecution is like, no, it's not about vampires. This is about a guy beating two people to death for a car. That's what this is about. The fact that they narrowed it down and they focused on that, I think, is to their credit in the end. Well, I think that's all we have on Rod Ferrell and his vampire clan today. Interested to hear what you guys think about this. We really dove into the death penalty and how death penalty sentencing works, so I'm sure you guys have more questions about that. Feel free to shoot us your questions, comments at prosecutorspod@gmail.com. We're also at prosecutorspod on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We're also on Reddit. Love you guys who are hanging out on Patreon with us and taking care of us. So glad you guys support us. You are awesome. We love hearing from you guys. We love reading your reviews. And I hope you'll keep telling your friends about this show so that more people can hear about it. We love reaching new people. We love getting those emails from people who say, I just discovered your show and it's awesome. Those are fantastic. So keep them coming. Well, Alice, do you have anything else you want to add before we sign off for today?
That's it, Brett. I mean, this was, it's so interesting because, like you said, the vampire is just kind of the ambience around it. It makes it fun to do right around Halloween, but this is really just a tragic murder of two people who were going about their lives and were senselessly taken.
No, that's 100% right, and I think we need to remember that, even with sort of the sensationalism that you see. You cannot read about this case without reading about the vampire cult. It is a part of it, and I think it needs to be discussed. But at the end of the day, I think we need to remember there were 2 victims here who were senselessly murdered, and we always try and be about the victims and be about justice on this podcast. Well, guys, that's all we have for today. We're getting closer to Halloween. Remember, if you pour salt around your house and you already have a spirit in your house, that just means you're keeping the spirit inside. So be careful when you use these kind of home remedies for your hauntings. It can just make things worse. Well, Alice, that's all I've got. We'll be back next week with our final Halloween October case. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
What's RPG?
Now, a role-playing game. So...
Oh.
Yeah. So...
Which he believed to be the center of vampiric? Is that how you say it?
Vampiric. It is.
Did I say that right? Murray?
Yep.
I always say that because, Houston, Houston, Mobile.
Oh, I know.
Is it malingering?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know why I doubt myself whenever I see words.
Well, you nailed it.
Okay. I nailed it. Thank you for once. Okay.
I had a great day. I worked on that motion.
I was trying to save you.
No, it was actually, I enjoyed the motion, so I was glad that you saved me.
No, I'm saying I was trying to save you because that is
You did. You saved me. I recognize
That's what
your
I'm
saving.
saying.
Thank you for saving me.
That's what I was trying to tell you.
I need more saving. The more saving, the better.